The first signs of war had arrived 6 months earlier, carried not by messengers, but by refugees. Families from the Ionian cities fled across the sea with tales of burning temples and enslaved populations. The Persian king Darius, they whispered, had sworn revenge for Athens' support of the Ionian revolt. His generals had already subjugated island after island, and now the greatest military force the world had ever seen was sailing directly toward the heart of Greek civilization. Philippides remembered the day he first heard the news. He had been training in the gymnasium, practicing the long-distance running that had made him one of Athens' most celebrated hemerodromoi. His instructor, old Euclides, had pulled him aside with an expression that merged pride and sorrow. "The strategos will have need of your legs soon, boy," Euclides had said, using the Greek word for general. "War is coming, and fast runners win wars as surely as brave soldiers." At 23, Philippides was in his prime. Lean and muscled from years of training, his body was an instrument of endurance. He could maintain a steady pace for hours, navigating treacherous mountain paths in darkness, going without food or water longer than seemed humanly possible. But he had never imagined his skills would be needed for something as monumental as this. The Athenian assembly had debated for weeks. Should they meet the Persians head-on or retreat behind the city walls? The decision ultimately fell to 10 generals elected by the people, and among them, Miltiades stood out as the voice of action. A veteran of Persian campaigns, he understood their tactics, their weaknesses, and their overwhelming confidence. "They expect us to cower," Miltiades had declared before the assembled citizens. "They believe we'll hide behind our walls until they starve us out or our allies abandon us. But if we march to Marathon, if we meet them on ground of our choosing, we can dictate the terms of this battle." It was a bold strategy, perhaps even reckless. Marathon was a coastal plain 26 miles northeast of Athens, surrounded by hills and marshland, terrain that could either trap the Greeks or neutralize the Persian cavalry advantage. Everything depended on timing, discipline, and courage. Philippides had been in the crowd that day, and when Miltiades' gaze swept across the assembly, the general's eyes had locked on his for a brief moment. There was a question in that look, a challenge. "Are you ready?" The mobilization of Athens had been swift and total. Every able-bodied citizen between 20 and 40 was called to serve. Blacksmiths worked through the night repairing armor and sharpening spears. Wives and mothers prepared supplies, dried fish, barley cakes, wine mixed with honey for energy. The city transformed from a place of commerce and philosophy into a war camp almost overnight. Philippides had reported to the assembly point with his equipment, a small shield, a dagger, and the light tunic that allowed him maximum mobility. As a runner, he wasn't expected to fight in the front lines, but every man carried weapons. The Athenian ideal was that of the citizen soldier, equally capable with sword and stylus, prepared to defend democracy with blood if words proved insufficient. The march to Marathon had taken most of a day. 10,000 hoplites in full armor, moving in disciplined columns along the coastal road, their shields catching the sunlight like mirrors. Philippides had jogged alongside the formation, his runner's legs easily keeping pace with the march. He had used the time to study the men around him, farmers and merchants, poets and potters, all united by citizenship and the threat to their way of life. Among them was Aeschylus, a young playwright whose early works had begun to attract attention in Athens. Despite his literary inclinations, Aeschylus wore his armor with confidence and carried his spear like a man who knew how to use it. His brother Cynaegeirus marched beside him, a giant of a man whose reputation for wrestling was well known in the gymnasiums of Athens. "You look thoughtful for a runner," Aeschylus had said, falling into step beside Philippides during a rest break. "Contemplating mortality?" "Contemplating distance," Philippides had replied. "How far a man can go, how much he can endure, what lies beyond the point where the body says it cannot continue." "Ah, the philosophy of the athlete," Aeschylus smiled. "You know, there's poetry in what you do, the rhythm of breathing, the meter of footfalls. Maybe I'll write about it someday." "Write about victory first," Philippides had said. "We'll need songs to celebrate what we're about to do." The army had reached Marathon by late afternoon and immediately set about establishing a defensive position. Miltiades had chosen their ground with care, high enough to observe the Persian movements, close enough to the marshes to limit enemy cavalry maneuvers, with a clear path back to Athens if retreat became necessary. The Persian fleet had arrived the next morning, an armada so vast it seemed to fill the bay. Philippides had watched from the hills as boat after boat disgorged soldiers onto the beach. They came in waves, first the light infantry, then the elite troops in their distinctive scale armor, finally the cavalry with their magnificent horses bred in the plains of Persia. The sheer scale of the enemy force was terrifying. Philippides had traveled widely as a messenger, had seen armies before, but nothing like this. The Persians had conquered an empire stretching from Egypt to India. Their soldiers spoke dozens of languages, worshipped dozens of gods, but all served one king, Darius, who claimed divine authority to rule the entire world. Against this tide of humanity, Athens had sent 10,000 men. The math was brutally simple and entirely discouraging. Yet that night, as Philippides sat by a campfire sharing a meal of bread and olives with his fellow soldiers, he felt not despair, but a strange sense of privilege. He was witnessing history. Whatever happened tomorrow would echo through the ages. If they lost, Greek civilization might be extinguished, replaced by Persian satrapies where free speech and democratic debate were treasonous concepts. If they won, if by some miracle they actually won, it would prove that free men, fighting for their homes, were worth 100 slaves fighting for a tyrant's glory. Eucles found him that evening. The old trainer had insisted on coming with the army, claiming that his boys needed him, though everyone knew the march had taxed his aging body terribly. He sat down heavily beside Philippides, his joints cracking audibly. "Do you remember what I taught you about the wall?" Eucles asked, his voice soft in the darkness. Philippides nodded. The wall was what runners called that moment during a long race when every part of the body screams to stop, when pain becomes absolute and the mind begins inventing reasons to quit. Good runners learn to push through the wall, to find reserves of strength they didn't know existed. "Tomorrow you may hit a wall unlike any you faced in training," Eucles continued, "not just in your legs, but in your heart, in your spirit. The Persians will try to break you with their numbers, with their noise, with the knowledge that defeat means death or slavery. And if we somehow prevail, if the gods smile on Athens, you may be asked to run again when your body has nothing left to give." "I understand," Philippides said.
"No, boy, you don't," Eurycles replied, but his tone was gentle. "No one can understand until they face it. But I believe in you. I've trained dozens of runners, and you're the best I've ever seen. Not because you're the fastest, but because you refuse to quit. That stubbornness, that absolute refusal to surrender, that's what will carry you through tomorrow." The old man stood with difficulty and placed a weathered hand on Philippides' head in blessing. "Run well, my student. Run for Athens. Run for freedom. Run for all of us who can no longer match your pace." Philippides had tried to sleep after that, but rest proved elusive. Around him, thousands of men were having the same struggle, each dealing with fear and anticipation in their own way. Some prayed to the gods, Ares for courage, Athena for wisdom, Zeus for victory. Others sharpened weapons that were already sharp, checked armor that had been checked a dozen times. A few simply stared into the darkness, their thoughts unreadable. As dawn approached, Philippides rose and walked to the edge of the camp, looking out over the plain where the Persian campfires still burned. Somewhere in that vast enemy host, soldiers from a dozen nations were also preparing for battle. Many of them were conscripts who had no choice but to fight, slaves to Persian expansion. They would fight because they were ordered to, because the alternative was execution. But the Greeks would fight for something different. They would fight because they chose to, because democracy gave them the right to decide their own fates, because freedom was a principle worth defending with blood and bronze. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Philippides heard the call to assembly. The battle was about to begin. The next morning, Philippides received his orders. He was to run to Sparta, the only military power in Greece strong enough to tip the scales. The journey would take him across some of the most brutal terrain in the Mediterranean. The Parthenon Mountains, where wolves and bandits roamed, where summer heat could kill as efficiently as any sword. He left before dawn with the desperate message clutched in his mind. 10,000 Persians, no, 30,000 or more, had landed at Marathon. Athens stood alone against an empire. Would Sparta honor the alliance forged in better times? The first day tested every aspect of his conditioning as he climbed steep passes, his sandaled feet finding purchase on loose scree and sharp rocks. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, turning the mountain paths into furnaces. Philippides rationed his water carefully, knowing that dehydration would end his run more surely than exhaustion. By nightfall, he had covered 70 kilometers, and he allowed himself 3 hours of sleep under an olive tree before continuing in the pre-dawn darkness. The second day brought hallucinations. Dehydration and exhaustion began to blur the line between reality and dream. At one point, running through a dense forest, Philippides could have sworn he saw the god Pan himself watching from the shadows. A wild-eyed figure with goat legs and an otherworldly smile. The vision filled him with sudden energy, as though the deity had breathed strength directly into his lungs. "Run, mortal! Run, and I will run with you. Your struggle pleases me. Your determination honors me. I will remember Athens when the gods debate the fate of men." Whether Pan actually appeared or whether exhaustion had conjured the image, Philippides felt renewed purpose. He pushed on, his legs moving in the mechanical rhythm that all distance runners know, that place beyond thought where the body continues purely on will and training. He reached Sparta by sunset of the second day, collapsing at the feet of the ephors, the Spartan leaders, and gasping out his message between ragged breaths. Athens needed help. The Persians had landed at Marathon in overwhelming numbers. Would Sparta march to war? The answer, delivered with infuriating Spartan stoicism, crushed him. The Carneia festival was underway, a sacred period when Spartan law forbade military campaigns. To march during Carneia would anger the gods, invite divine retribution. They would send their army, yes, the most feared fighting force in Greece would march to Athens' aid, but not until the full moon, 6 days hence. 6 days. The battle would be over by then, one way or another. Athens would stand victorious or lie in ruins. Philippides wanted to argue, to rage at the Spartans for hiding behind religious customs while Athens faced annihilation. But he had no breath for arguments, and deep down he understood. The Spartans were legendary for their discipline precisely because they never broke their own laws, even when convenience suggested they should. It was what made them Spartans. He thanked them formally, his voice still hoarse from the run and the dust he had swallowed on the mountain paths. Then, without even a full night's rest, he turned and began the journey back. The return trip was worse than the outbound journey. His legs, already pushed beyond reasonable limits, now operated in a realm of constant pain. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest. His feet, shredded by sharp stones and punishing distances, left bloody prints on the paths. He wrapped them in strips torn from his tunic, but the makeshift bandages were soon soaked through. Yet he ran. Athens had to know. Miltiades had to understand that there would be no reinforcements, that the army at Marathon would face the Persians alone. Strategic decisions hung on this information, whether to attack or defend, whether to hold Marathon or fall back to Athens, whether to seek battle or try to delay until the Spartan reinforcements arrived. The journey back became an exercise in mental endurance as much as physical stamina. Philippides broke the distance into smaller sections in his mind, not 240 kilometers, but the distance to the next village, the next water source, the next landmark. He negotiated with his body, promising rest after each milestone and then breaking that promise and pushing on. At night, when he allowed himself brief periods of sleep, he dreamed of running. In his dreams, he ran effortlessly across golden fields under perfect skies, his legs fresh and strong, the destination always visible on the horizon, but never quite reached. He would awake from these dreams feeling betrayed, his real body a prison of pain compared to the freedom of his dream self. On the third day, as he descended from the mountains toward the coast where Marathon lay, Philippides experienced a moment of crystalline clarity. The pain was still there, it would always be there, but it no longer defined him. He had transcended it, moved beyond it into a state where suffering was simply a fact, like the sun in the sky or the ground beneath his feet. This, he realized, is what Eurycles had been trying to teach him all those years. Not how to avoid the wall, but how to make peace with it, to accept pain as the price of extraordinary effort and keep moving anyway. He reached the Athenian camp at Marathon in the late afternoon, stumbling into the command tent where Miltiades and the other generals were studying maps of the terrain. The news of Sparta's delay hung in the air like smoke from a sacrificial fire, acrid, choking, final. For a long moment no one spoke. The generals exchanged glances, each weighing the implications. They had hoped, perhaps even expected, that Spartan reinforcements would arrive in time. Now that hope was extinguished. Finally, Miltiades broke the silence. He said, "Then we fight with what we have." He quietly, his voice carried no panic, only grim determination. "We fight for our homes, our families, our way of life. That will have to be enough." The other generals nodded, some reluctantly, others with fierce agreement. The decision was made. Athens would not retreat. They would not abandon Marathon and hide behind city walls. They would face the Persians here, on this coastal plain, and trust in Greek courage to overcome Persian numbers. Philippides was given wine and food, and a physician examined his shredded feet. The man shook his head in amazement. "I've seen marathon runners before," the physician said, using the term for professional long-distance messengers, "but never one who's covered this much ground in so short a time. Your feet will need weeks to heal properly." "They'll need to last another day," Philippides replied, thinking of Miltiades' words about carrying one more message. That night, as he lay in his bedroll trying to let his body recover, Philippides thought about all the miles he had run in his life. Training miles in his youth, racing miles in competitions, messenger miles carrying dispatchers across Attica. But none of those miles had carried the weight of these last few days. He had run with the fate of civilization on his shoulders, and somehow his legs had not buckled under that burden. Tomorrow would bring battle, and if Athens prevailed, if they somehow achieved the impossible, he might be asked to run one more time, to carry news of victory back to a city that waited in anxious hope. His last thought before exhaustion dragged him into sleep was a prayer to Hermes, god of travelers and messengers. "Let my legs have one more run in them, just one more."
The tension before battle is a peculiar thing. Philippides had experienced it during his long runs when facing a particularly treacherous section of mountain path. That moment where every sense sharpens, where time seems to slow, where your body knows it's about to be pushed beyond normal limits.
Now, multiplied by 10,000 men, that tension became almost unbearable. It was a living thing, pressing down on the assembled Greek army, making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. The Athenian phalanx formed on the hillside as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Each man took his position in the rigid formation that was the cornerstone of Greek warfare. Hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder, their large round shields, the auspice, overlapping to create a wall of bronze. 8 ranks deep, the phalanx was designed to be an unstoppable force when moving forward, each man pushing the one ahead while protecting the right side of his navel with his shield. The genius of the phalanx was that it turned individual soldiers into a single organism. A man alone might flee in terror, but bound into the formation, surrounded by his fellow citizens, there was nowhere to go but forward. The shame of breaking rank and exposing your neighbors was worse than the fear of death. Philippides found himself in the 4th rank, spear held high, his racing legs now planted firmly on the ground. To his left stood Aeschylus, a playwright and philosopher who had volunteered to fight despite having no obligation. To his right was Canegurus, a bull of a man, whose brother was one of the generals. Both men were breathing hard, not from exertion but from anticipation. "Today we write history with bronze and blood," Aeschylus murmured, his poet's voice steady despite the circumstances. "Today Athens learns whether freedom is merely a word or a truth worth dying for." "Freedom is always worth dying for," Canegurus replied, his voice a low rumble. "But I intend to make the Persians do the dying while we do the living." Around them men made final preparations. They checked the fit of their helmets, ensuring the cheek guards were snug but not so tight they restricted breathing. They tested their shield grips, making sure the leather straps were properly positioned. They whispered prayers to their patron deities, made promises of sacrifices if they survived, and said silent farewells to loved ones they might never see again. Philippides touched the amulet around his neck, a small bronze charm of Hermes that his mother had given him before she died. She had been a weaver, had raised him alone after his father's death, and saved every drachma to pay for his training. She wished she could see him now, standing among Athens' defenders. She would have been proud, he thought, even knowing the danger. Across the plain, the Persian army was completing its deployment. Their formation was different from the Greek phalanx, looser, more flexible, designed to allow their superior numbers to envelop and overwhelm. The front ranks consisted of Sparabara, infantry armed with large wicker shields and short spears. Behind them came waves of archers, their bows capable of darkening the sky with arrows. And on the flanks, held in reserve for now, were the feared Persian cavalry, mounted warriors who could strike with devastating speed and mobility. The Persian host stretched as far as the eye could see. Their banners rippled in the morning breeze, displaying the symbols of a dozen conquered nations. This was more than an army. It was a demonstration of imperial power, a statement that resistance to Persia was futile. General Miltiades moved along the Greek line, his armor catching the sunlight. He stopped here and there to clasp a shoulder, to exchange a quiet word of encouragement. When he reached Philippides, the general smiled, a fierce, predatory expression that spoke of absolute confidence. "I may need those legs of yours again before this day is done," Miltiades said, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. "Can you run one more time?" "I can run until my heart stops beating," Philippides replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Miltiades nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But if it does, know that Athens will remember. Your name will be spoken with honor as long as men value courage and sacrifice." The general moved on, continuing his inspection of the line. When he reached the center of the formation, he took his position among the front ranks, leading from the front, as any Athenian general was expected to do. Democracy meant shared risk, shared sacrifice. The men who voted for war were the same men who fought it. Miltiades raised his spear high, the signal that every man had been waiting for. The moment stretched, suspended between peace and violence, between life and death. Then his voice rang out, clear and commanding, carrying across the assembled ranks. "For Athens, for freedom, for our homes and our children, advance!" What happened next defied every convention of ancient warfare and would be studied by military strategists for millennia to come. The Greek phalanx began to move down the hillside, not at the usual measured pace, but at a jog. Armor rattled, spears bobbed, and 10,000 throats released a war cry that echoed across the plain like thunder. The Persians, who had been expecting a slow, methodical advance, giving them time to deploy their archers and position their cavalry, stood in confusion as the Greeks accelerated. The jog became a run. This is where Philippides' training proved invaluable in ways he had never anticipated. Maintaining formation while running across broken ground required the same focus and rhythm he used during his long-distance races. He adjusted his stride to match those around him, kept his shield steady despite the awkward weight, felt the pounds of bronze armor becoming almost negligible as battle fury and adrenaline flooded his veins. The man beside him, a baker from the Keramikis district, stumbled on a rock, and Philippides reflexively reached out to steady him without breaking stride. The baker flashed a grateful grin, and they ran on together, part of the human wave crashing towards the enemy line. The Persians scrambled to respond. Officers shouted orders in a cacophony of languages: Persian, Median, Bactrian, Assyrian. Archers drew their bows, knocking arrows with practiced speed. But the Greeks were covering the distance faster than anyone thought possible. 800 meters, 600, 400. The element of surprise, so carefully calculated by Miltiades, was working perfectly. The Persian arrows flew, a deadly cloud of shafts arcing through the bright morning air. Thousands of arrows, enough to blot out the sun as the ancient saying went. Some found gaps in the Greek formation. Men fell, screaming, trampled by those behind them who could not stop their momentum. Philippides heard the wet thunk of an arrow punching into the shield of the man in front of him, and saw another arrow glance off a bronze helmet with the spark of metal on metal. But the phalanx couldn't slow. The front ranks raised their shields, creating a canopy of bronze, and the charge continued. The casualties were real, but manageable. Dozens dead, perhaps 100 wounded, but the formation held. 9,000 Greeks were still running, still accelerating, building momentum that would hit the Persian line like a battering ram. 300 meters, 200 meters. Philippides could see individual Persian faces now, dark eyes widening in alarm, mouths opening to shout warnings, hands gripping weapons with sudden desperation. The wicker shields came up, spears lowered. The Sparabara braced themselves, planting their shields in the ground and setting their spears at an angle to receive the charge. But nothing could fully prepare them for the impact. At 100 meters, the Greeks released a final primal war cry, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the stones of Marathon and the hills of Attica, from every ancestor who had ever fought for Greek freedom. It was the sound of civilization itself refusing to submit. Then the two armies collided with the sound like the end of the world. The impact of the Greek charge was absolutely devastating. The first rank of the phalanx hit the Persian line with such incredible force that men were simply knocked backward, their lighter shields and armor no match for the momentum of the hoplites. Spears punched through wicker and leather with terrible efficiency. Shields slammed into faces and chests with bone-breaking force. The carefully planned Persian formation disintegrated into chaos within seconds. Philippides found himself in the heart of the melee, his spear thrusting forward mechanically. Training took over completely. Thrust, recover, step forward, thrust again. Don't think about the man you're killing. Don't look at his eyes. Don't wonder if he has a family. Just thrust and step and thrust again. Beside him, Aeschylus fought with surprising ferocity for a poet. His spear moved in quick, economical strikes. On the other side, Cinegyrus roared like a bear, his massive arms driving his spear through Persian armor as if it were parchment. The Greek phalanx drove forward like a living battering ram. The Persian center, shocked by the ferocity and speed of the charge, began to fall back. Men in the rear ranks, unable to see what was happening at the front, started to panic. The psychological effect of the Greek charge was working exactly as Miltiades had predicted. The Persians had never faced an enemy crazy enough to charge at them, and they didn't know how to respond. But Miltiades had planned for more than just the initial shock.
As the Persian center began to buckle, the Greek wings, stronger and deeper than the center, began to curve inward, a tactical maneuver called the double envelopment. The goal was not just to defeat the Persians, but to trap them, to turn their superior numbers into a liability by compressing them into an ever smaller space.
He ran for Athens itself, not just the physical city of stone and wood, but the dream it represented. The dream that humans could create a society based on reason and justice rather than the whim of kings. The Acropolis appeared before him, the temples gleaming white in the afternoon sun. The main gates stood open, and people were pouring out, having heard that a runner approached. Philippides recognized faces in the crowd, merchants from the agora, politicians from the assembly, families of the soldiers who had marched to Marathon. They needed to know. They needed to hear the news from him. Philippides summoned the last fragments of his strength. His legs, which had been operating on pure will for the last several miles, carried him through the gates. The crowd parted before him, and he saw the steps of the assembly building ahead, the same steps where he had received his orders days ago. He reached the steps and tried to climb them, but his legs finally gave out completely. All the damage accumulated over 3 days of impossible running, all the exhaustion from battle, all the pain he had been pushing through, it all crashed down at once. His body was done. It had given everything and had nothing left. He collapsed, his body shutting down, every system that had been pushed past its breaking point now failing simultaneously. His heart, which had been beating at impossible rates for hours, began to flutter irregularly. His lungs, raw and burning, struggled to draw breath. His vision went dark at the edges, consciousness starting to slip away. Hands caught him, lowered him gently to the ground. Faces surrounded him, concerned, questioning, desperate for news. He recognized some of them. There was Themistocles, one of the rising political leaders. There was Aristides the Just, known for his fairness in judgment. There were wives and mothers and children of the men who had marched to Marathon. Philippides opened his mouth, his throat parched and raw, struggled to form words. But he had to tell them. He had run all this way to deliver this message. He couldn't fail now, not when he was so close. With the last of his strength, drawing on reserves that shouldn't exist, Philippides orsed out the words that Athens needed to hear. "Neniki kamen," he gasped. "We have won! Marathon, victory! Persians, defeated!" Joy erupted around him like a physical force. People were crying, embracing, shouting the news to those behind them. Athens was saved. The Persians had been defeated. Democracy would survive. The impossible had happened. Philippides heard all this as though from a great distance. The world was fading now, growing dim at the edges, the sounds becoming muffled and distorted. He had done what was asked of him. He had delivered the message. His duty was complete. He tried to say more, tried to warn them about the Persian fleet sailing toward the city, but the words wouldn't come. His body had given everything it had, and now it was simply shutting down, systems failing one by one as the accumulated damage became too much to sustain. Old Euclid appeared in his fading vision, kneeling beside him, tears streaming down the weathered face. His old trainer's mouth was moving, saying something, but Philippides couldn't hear the words anymore. Everything was growing distant, like he was falling backward into a deep well. Philippides thought, in those final moments, that running had always been a kind of prayer, an offering of the body to something greater than oneself. And today he had given everything, had offered his entire being in service of his city and the ideals it represented. His last thought, before the light faded completely, was of the road stretching out ahead of him, golden in eternal sunlight, where he could run forever, without pain or exhaustion,
where his legs were young and strong again, where the joy of pure movement awaited. Then Philippides, the greatest runner Athens had ever known, took his final breath and was still. The silence that fell over the immediate crowd was profound. Even as others continued to celebrate, not yet understanding what had happened, those closest to Philippides recognized the truth. He had literally run himself to death to bring them the news of victory. Euclid closed his student's eyes gently, his own tears falling freely now. "You ran well, boy. You ran better than anyone ever has or ever will. You showed us all what it means to give everything for something you believe in." Within minutes, the news spread, not just of the victory at Marathon, but of the runner who had died delivering the message. The celebration took on a different character, joy mixed with profound grief, triumph shadowed by sacrifice. Themistocles knelt beside Philippides' body, his face grave. "He should have rested," someone said. "He should have sent another messenger. There'd been time to recover." "No," Themistocles replied quietly. "This was his run to make. This was his destiny, I think. Some men are born for moments like this, to show the rest of us what human beings are capable of when everything depends on it." As the sun began to set over Athens, casting long shadows across the city, a messenger arrived with more news. The army from Marathon was marching back at a forced pace, and more importantly, the Persian fleet, having seen the Athenian forces returning to defend the city, had given up their planned attack and sailed for Asia. Athens was saved. Twice over, once on the battlefield at Marathon, and once by a runner's desperate final race.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The funeral held for Philippides 3 days later was attended by thousands. Even the soldiers returning from Marathon, still exhausted from the battle and the forced march back to Athens, made sure to be present. General Miltiades himself delivered the eulogy, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "I have seen courage on the battlefield," Miltiades said, standing before Philippides' funeral pyre. "I have seen men face impossible odds without flinching, have seen warriors fight until their last breath, but what Philippides did transcends even that. He did not die facing an enemy's sword. He died because he pushed his body beyond what any body can endure. And he did it not once, but repeatedly, for days on end, because Athens needed him." The general paused, looking out over the sea of faces. "When I asked him if he could run one more time, if his legs had one more race in them, do you know what he said? He said, 'I can run until my heart stops beating.' And he meant it literally. That level of dedication, that absolute commitment to duty, that is what saved us. Not just our swords and spears, but the spirit embodied in men like Philippides." Aeschylus, still grieving for his brother Cynegeirus, had composed a poem for the occasion. He recited it in a voice thick with emotion. "He ran as the gods run, with purpose divine, his feet barely touching the earth's ancient line. From Sparta to Marathon, Athens to fame, he carried our hopes like an Olympic flame. Through mountains and battles, through pain beyond measure, he gave us his all, his most precious treasure. And when at last his noble heart ceased its beat, he'd run the good race, his mission complete. Let no man say that Athens was saved by the sword alone, for victory rode on a runner's tired legs to our home." In the days and weeks that followed, the full scope of what had happened at Marathon began to sink in. The victory wasn't just military, it was psychological, cultural, philosophical. Athens had proven that free citizens fighting for their own homes and their own ideals could defeat the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. The battle established patterns that would shape Western civilization for millennia. It proved that disciplined infantry could overcome superior numbers. It demonstrated the power of tactical innovation, Miltiades' strategy of thinning the center to strengthen the wings. The audacious decision to charge across open ground would be studied in military academies for thousands of years. But more than tactics, Marathon proved something about the human spirit. It showed that when people have something worth fighting for, real freedom, genuine self-governance, the ability to shape their own destinies, they become capable of extraordinary things. The Persians would return, of course. 10 years later, King Xerxes would lead an even larger invasion force against Greece. But Marathon had given the Greeks confidence, had shown them that Persian might was not invincible. When Xerxes came, the Greek city-states would unite as they never had before, would stand together at Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea, and they would win again. Athens itself underwent a transformation after Marathon. The victory sparked a golden age of culture and philosophy. The confidence gained on that bloody plain translated into artistic and intellectual achievement. Within a generation, Athens would produce Socrates, who revolutionized philosophy. Sophocles and Euripides would create theatrical works that are still performed today. The Parthenon would rise on the Acropolis, a physical manifestation of Athenian pride and achievement. Historians like Herodotus and Thucydides would emerge to record not just events, but to analyze causes and effects, creating the discipline of history itself. Democratic institutions would be refined and strengthened, becoming models that would influence political thought for millennia. All of this traced back in some way to that September day in 490 BC when 10,000 Greeks faced down an empire and won. And through it all, the story of Philippides endured. Parents told it to their children as a lesson in dedication and sacrifice. Teachers used it to illustrate the heights of human achievement. Philosophers debated its meaning. Was his death tragic or glorious? Could the same message have been delivered without such sacrifice? Was it rational to push oneself to death? Or did some causes justify such extreme measures? Euclid, who lived another 5 years after his student's death, established a memorial at the spot where Philippides had collapsed. It was a simple stone marker with an inscription, "Here fell Philippides, who ran for Athens and gave all." The old trainer would often be found by the marker, especially on the anniversary of the battle, remembering the boy he had trained and the man he had become. 1 year after Marathon, on the anniversary of the battle, Euclid sat by the memorial with a young runner who had been asking about Philippides. The boy, barely 14, had heard the stories and wanted to become a hemeramdromi, wanted to serve Athens as Philippides had. Tell me what he was really like. Was he really as fast as they say? Could he really run for days without stopping? Euclid smiled, the expression both proud and sad. He was fast, yes, one of the fastest I ever trained. But speed wasn't what made Philippides special. I've known faster runners, athletes with more natural talent. What made him remarkable was his refusal to quit. He simply would not stop once he started something. Is that why he died? Because he wouldn't quit even when he should have? Maybe, Euclid admitted, but maybe that's also why he succeeded.
If he had been the kind of man who knew when to quit, who would say, "This is too much, I can't do this," then Athens might have fallen. Sometimes the line between heroism and foolishness is very thin. "Do you wish he had quit? Do you wish he had lived?" the boy pressed. Euclid was quiet for a long moment, looking at the memorial stone. "Every day," he said finally, "I wish he had lived to grow old, to have a family, to enjoy the peace he helped secure. But I also know that some people are born for specific moments. Philippides was born to run that last race. It's what he was meant to do, what all his training and all his life led toward. Who am I to wish away a man's destiny?" The boy absorbed this, and then asked one more question. "Do you think anyone will ever run like that again? Will anyone ever give everything the way he did?" Euclid looked out toward the road leading from the city, the same road Philippides had run in his final and fatal race. "I hope so," he said quietly, "not because I wish anyone else to die, but because I hope Athens will always have citizens willing to give everything when everything is needed. That's what makes us Athenians, what makes us free. We don't serve at the whim of kings. We choose our own sacrifices, make our own decisions about what's worth fighting for, worth dying for. That's what Philippides showed us. Not just that one man can run 26 miles after fighting a battle. Any strong runner might manage that, though it would be difficult. No, he showed us that when you truly believe in something, when you love your city and your people and your way of life enough, you can push beyond any limit, endure any pain, overcome any obstacle.
And that, Euclides finished, standing up with difficulty, his old joints creaking, is a lesson worth dying to teach. As the years passed, Marathon took on almost mythical status. The site of the battle became a place of pilgrimage. Veterans would return to walk the plain, to remember fallen comrades, to marvel at what they had accomplished. The tumuli, burial mounds, that marked where the Athenian and Plataean dead were buried, became sacred sites. Artistic representations of the battle appeared throughout Athens. Sculptors created statues of hoplites in fighting poses. Painters decorated vases with scenes from the battle. The victory at Marathon became a central part of Athenian identity, a touchstone they would return to again and again when facing new challenges. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was not in art or politics, but in the way Marathon changed how Greeks thought about themselves. Before the battle, the Greek city-states saw themselves as small, vulnerable entities, constantly at risk from larger powers. After Marathon, they understood that courage and innovation could overcome numerical superiority, that free citizens were worth more than enslaved conscripts. This psychological shift made possible everything that followed: the successful defense against Xerxes' invasion, the flowering of the Golden Age, the spread of Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean world. Marathon proved that the Greek way of life was worth defending and that it could be defended successfully. And at the heart of this transformation was the story of one runner who gave everything. Philippides became, in a sense, the embodiment of the Athenian ideal, the citizen who serves the polis without expectation of reward, who gives everything when called upon, who values the collective good above personal survival. He was living proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things, that heroes were not just mythical figures from the age of legends, but real humans who made difficult choices and lived with the consequences. The philosophical schools that emerged in Athens during its golden age often debated Philippides' example. Was his tragedy the unnecessary waste of a talented life? Or was it a triumph,
the perfect fulfillment of the citizen's duty. Could he have achieved the same result by being more careful, more measured? Or did the situation demand exactly what he gave? Everything, without reservation or calculation. These debates had no simple answers, and that was precisely the point. Philippides' story raised fundamental questions about duty, sacrifice, the individual versus the collective, the value of human life versus the value of human freedom. These were the questions that animated Athenian philosophy, that drove Socrates to question everything, that led Plato to envision ideal forms of government. In a way, Philippides' death was as important to Athenian intellectual life as the military victory at Marathon. It provided a real-world example of the kind of ethical dilemmas that philosophers loved to explore. It was concrete proof that abstract ideals, freedom, duty, sacrifice had real implications, real costs, real meaning. The story also resonated because it was so human. Philippides wasn't a demigod like Heracles or Achilles. He had no divine parentage, no supernatural powers. He was just a man with exceptional endurance and unwavering determination. Anyone could, theoretically, do what he did, not easily, not without cost, but it was within the realm of human possibility. That accessibility made his achievement all the more inspiring. If Philippides could push himself to such limits, then perhaps others could too. If one runner could save a city through sheer willpower, then perhaps ordinary citizens could accomplish great things when circumstances demanded it. This was revolutionary thinking in the ancient world. Most cultures celebrated kings and warriors, divine heroes and legendary figures. But Athens celebrated a runner, a messenger, who happened to be in the right place at the right time and made the choice to give everything. Years later, a young Plato would use Philippides' example in his dialogues about the ideal state. He argued that the perfect polis needed citizens like Philippides, people who valued the collective good above personal comfort, who were willing to sacrifice when necessary, who understood that freedom came with responsibilities as well as rights. Aristotle, in his treatises on ethics, would point to Philippides as an example of virtue taken to its logical extreme. Here was a man who exemplified courage, endurance, duty, and self-sacrifice. But was it virtuous to push oneself to death? Aristotle argued for moderation in all things, but he acknowledged that extreme situations might call for extreme responses. These philosophical debates ensured that Philippides' name remained alive in intellectual circles long after the veterans of Marathon had passed away. Each generation rediscovered his story, reinterpreted it for their own times, found new meaning in his sacrifice. But perhaps the truest memorial to Philippides was not in philosophy or art, but in the lives of ordinary Athenians who, when faced with their own challenges and crises, remembered the runner and found strength to continue. The merchant who refused to compromise his principles even at great cost. The soldier who held his position against overwhelming odds. The politician who spoke truth even when silence would have been safer. The artist who pursued his vision despite poverty and rejection. All of them, in their own ways, were running their own marathons, pushing through their own walls of pain and doubt, refusing to quit even when quitting would have been easier and more rational. That, ultimately, was Philippides' legacy. Not just the military victory he helped secure, not just the political and cultural achievements that followed, but the enduring example of human potential, the knowledge that when something matters enough, when the cause is just, and the need is great, ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. He showed Athens, and through Athens, the entire Western world, that limits are often self-imposed, that what seems impossible might merely be very difficult, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. Every time someone pushes through pain to help another person, every time a citizen stands up for principles at personal cost, every time someone refuses to quit, even when quitting would have been entirely understandable, Philippides runs again. His race never really ended. It continues in every act of selfless service, every moment of genuine courage, every sacrifice made for something larger than self.
More than 2 millennia have passed since Philippides fell on those Athenian steps, yet his story endures with a power that transcends time and culture. The death of this one runner, this ordinary man who did extraordinary things, continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental truths about human nature and human potential. In the modern world, the legacy of Philippides lives on in ways both literal and metaphorical. When the Olympic Games were revived in 1896, organizers sought to honor ancient Greek athletic tradition while commemorating one of history's most significant battles. They created a long-distance running event covering approximately the distance from Marathon to Athens, 26.2 miles or 42.195 kilometers to be precise. They called it the Marathon. That first modern Olympic marathon, held from Marathon to Athens in 1896, was won by a Greek shepherd named Spiridon Louis. His victory in front of Greek royalty and international spectators was seen as a symbolic link to ancient glory, a connection across the centuries to that September day in 490 BC when everything hung in the balance. Since then, the marathon has become one of the most iconic athletic events in the world. Every year, millions of people run marathons in cities across the globe: New York, London, Tokyo, Berlin, Boston. Most of these runners don't think consciously about Philippides or the Battle of Marathon. They run for personal reasons, to test themselves, to honor someone they've lost, to raise money for causes they believe in, to prove something to themselves or others, or simply because the challenge speaks to something deep in their spirit. But in a profound sense, every marathon runner is channeling something of Philippides' legacy. They're choosing to push their bodies beyond comfortable limits. They're refusing to quit even when every muscle screams for mercy. They're making the conscious decision that some finish lines are worth the suffering required to reach them. The experience of hitting the wall around mile 20 of a marathon, that point where glycogen stores are depleted and the body begins to consume its own muscle tissue for fuel, where every step becomes an act of will, is something Philippides would have recognized. That moment when runners must choose between the rational decision to stop and the irrational determination to continue is precisely the choice he faced in his final run. And every time a marathon runner pushes through that wall, finds reserves they didn't know existed, and crosses the finish line on legs that no longer want to support them, they're proving what Philippides proved: that the human spirit can overcome the body's limitations, that determination can triumph over biology, that will is sometimes stronger than flesh. Beyond the literal marathon, Philippides' story has become a metaphor for any extended struggle that requires sustained effort over time. Cancer patients fighting through brutal treatment regimens speak of running their own marathons. Activists working for social change across years or decades invoke marathon imagery. Entrepreneurs building businesses despite repeated setbacks see themselves in marathon terms. It's not a sprint, but a sustained effort where persistence matters more than initial speed. The phrase, "it's a marathon, not a sprint,"
has become shorthand for any endeavor requiring patience, endurance, and the willingness to keep going when immediate results aren't visible. This metaphor works precisely because of what Philippides represents: the understanding that some things worth achieving can't be rushed, that some distances can only be covered through sustained effort, that some victories come only to those who refuse to quit. The deeper legacy of Marathon and Philippides' run is philosophical and political. The battle proved that democracy could defend itself, that free citizens fighting for their own homes were more effective than conscripted armies fighting for distant kings. This wasn't just a military lesson, but a political one, with profound implications for Western civilization. The survival of Athens ensured the survival of democratic ideals during a crucial moment in history. If Persia had conquered Greece, if Marathon had ended differently, the entire trajectory of Western civilization might have changed. The philosophical schools that produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle might not have ever flourished. The theatrical traditions that gave us tragedy and comedy might not have developed. The historical methods pioneered by Herodotus and Thucydides might not have emerged. Democratic governance itself might have been strangled in its cradle, dismissed as a failed experiment that couldn't defend itself against imperial autocracy. The idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, that political power derived from citizens rather than divine right of kings, these revolutionary concepts survived because Athens survived. And Athens survived, in part, because one runner refused to quit. This is not to suggest that Philippides alone saved Western civilization. That would be absurd. History is shaped by countless forces, countless decisions, countless moments of consequence. But he was one thread in the tapestry, and his thread mattered. Remove it, and the pattern changes in ways both subtle and profound. The story also endures because it raises questions without providing easy answers. Was Philippides' sacrifice necessary or foolish? Could he have paced himself better, taken more time to recover, and still delivered the message? Did his death accomplish anything beyond what a living messenger might have achieved? These questions have no simple answers, and that's precisely what makes the story compelling. It forces us to grapple with difficult issues about duty and self-preservation, about when sacrifice is noble and when it's wasteful, about the line between heroism and self-destruction. In our modern world, we often valorize self-care and sustainable effort, and rightly so. We recognize that burning out in service of a cause doesn't help anyone in the long run. We understand that martyrdom sometimes is unnecessary, that living to fight another day has its own value. Yet we also recognize that sometimes, rarely, but genuinely sometimes, everything is actually on the line. Sometimes the situation demands everything we have and then some. Sometimes the cause is important enough, the need desperate enough, the moment critical enough, that extraordinary sacrifice becomes not just understandable, but necessary. The challenge is knowing which situation is which, having the wisdom to distinguish between moments that require measured effort and moments that demand everything. Philippides believed he was facing the latter, and history suggests he was right. But how do we make such judgments in our own lives, with our own challenges?
It's about recognizing that some things, democracy, freedom, justice, human dignity, are worth defending at great personal cost. Not because sacrifice is inherently noble, but because some principles, once lost, might never be recovered. Some moments in history are genuinely pivotal. Some struggles really are that important. Philippides teaches us about commitment without reservation. In our modern world of hedged bets and calculated risks, of always keeping something in reserve and never being too committed to any one thing, his example is both inspiring and unsettling. He held nothing back. He gave everything. He didn't calculate whether his sacrifice would be appreciated or remembered. He simply did what he believed the moment required.
There's something both admirable and terrifying about that level of commitment. Admirable because it represents a kind of purity of purpose we rarely see. Terrifying because most of us recognize that we probably couldn't make the same choice. We would be more careful, more measured, more concerned with our own survival. And that's okay. Not every moment is marathon. Not every message requires literal self-sacrifice to deliver. The world needs people who pace themselves, who survive to fight another day, who recognize that long-term sustainable effort often accomplishes more than spectacular burnout. But the world also needs to remember that people like Philippides exist and that occasionally, rarely, the situation demands exactly what he gave. Remembering his story keeps alive the possibility of absolute commitment, the understanding that some causes might actually be worth everything. The story also reminds us that heroes are human. Philippides wasn't a demigod or superhuman. He was a trained athlete who pushed himself beyond sustainable limits because he believed his city needed him. He made a choice, and that choice had consequences. He died young, never experiencing the peace and prosperity his sacrifice helped secure. There's tragedy in that, but there's also meaning. His life, though short, mattered profoundly. He affected history in ways that most people never do. His name is remembered 2,500 years later, while the names of kings and emperors from his era have been forgotten. Not because he sought glory or fame, by all accounts he was simply doing his duty, but because what he did resonated with something deep in human consciousness. The image of the runner pushing beyond all limits, refusing to quit despite pain and exhaustion, giving everything for something he believed in. That image speaks to something fundamental about what it means to be human. We are, at our best, creatures capable of transcending our limitations. We can push beyond pain, overcome fear, act against our own self-interest when principle demands it. We can be more than biology and self-preservation. We can choose meaning over comfort, purpose over safety, contribution over mere survival. That potential exists in all of us, though most of us will never be tested as Philippides was tested. Most of our struggles are less dramatic, our choices less obviously consequential. But they matter nonetheless. The parent working multiple jobs to provide for children, the activist organizing for justice despite threats and harassment, the artist pursuing a vision despite poverty and rejection, the whistleblower exposing corruption at great personal cost, the healthcare worker showing up during a pandemic, the teacher in an underfunded school refusing to give up on students. All of them are running their own marathons, fighting their own battles, making their own sacrifices. And all of them, whether they know it or not, are heirs to Philippides' legacy. As long as people push themselves beyond what seems possible, as long as individuals sacrifice for collective good, as long as courage exists in the world, Philippides runs still. His race never ended. It transformed into 1,000,000 races, 1,000,000,000 acts of courage, an infinity of moments when humans chose to give more than seemed humanly possible because something mattered enough to demand it. That is the true victory of Marathon, not just the military triumph over Persia, not just the survival of Athens and democracy, but the eternal testament to human potential, human courage, human will. Philippides ran for Athens, but in running for Athens, he ran for all of us, showing every generation that comes after what humans can achieve when they refuse to quit, when they push beyond every limit, when they believe in something worth running for. Nenneke Kamen, we have won. Not just at Marathon, but in every subsequent struggle where human courage prevailed over oppression, where determination overcame obstacles, where ordinary people accomplished extraordinary things. The race continues, the legacy endures, and as long as humans dream of freedom, as long as we value courage, as long as we believe some things are worth sacrificing for, the spirit of Philippides will never die. He ran well. He ran until the end. And in doing so, he showed us all how far the human spirit can carry us when we have something worth running for.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.